Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this insightful webinar with so great speakers. So we intend to talk about Alabama decision that consider embryos as child. So I encourage all of you to make questions on our chat or QA tab. If you don't find the QA tab, is beside the chat tab. I'm Dr. Fernanda Pacheco. I'm an REI in Brazil and also the Director of Medical Affairs at Progenesis. And I'm here today with Bryan Hughes, who is our Sales Director. Dr. Sheila Ali is the Director of Innovation at Progenesis. And we also have Lindsay and Thomas, who are in the marketing department and are going to assist us. I encourage all of you be around at the very end of this discussion because we are going to raffle a free registration for GENES, our symposium, Progenesis Symposium, that's going to happen in San Diego at the end of May. At the end of the discussion, we are going to announce the person that won this free registration. As well, we are going to offer a 50% discount for another person to register for our webinar. So please, Bryan, you can present our prestigious speakers.
Yes, welcome everybody attending the conference today. We're excited to present this month's Progenesis Academy webinar on the Alabama IVF Supreme Court decision and how the legal system is impacting medicine. As you know, last month in LePage versus Center for Reproductive Medicine, a case brought by IVF patients, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that an unimplanted human embryo is a child for purposes of the state's wrongful death statute. The court held that intended parents with embryos created through in vitro fertilization can sue their IVF clinic for wrongful death rather than negligence if the embryos are destroyed through the clinic's fault. This ruling arrives, of course, in the wake of the US Supreme Court decision in Dobbs to overturn Roe v. Wade, which resulted in a few states to enact so-called personhood amendments, which attaches personhood at time of conception. While in Alabama, a wrongful death suit from the death of an unborn child in utero had been on the books for a while, the legislation taking effect in 2006 amended the criminal code to include an unborn child in utero at any stage of development, regardless of viability, as a person and a human being related to the laws dealing with homicide, manslaughter, and assault. And so the legal issue in LePage, as the majority opinion put it, was whether Alabama law contains an unwritten exception to that rule for extrauterine children. That is, unborn children who are located external to a biological uterus at the time they are killed. Interpreting the wrongful death of a minor act, the LePage ruling, which overturned the lower court's rulings, is believed to be the first time a court has held that damaged or destroyed IVF embryos can be included in wrongful death lawsuits, and generated widespread alarm among supporters of IVF treatment, including many of those who are here today. We have an open Q&A from our audience, and listeners can submit questions using the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. We will prioritize those questions and pepper them into the conversation, so feel free to type your questions into the box. On the panel today, we have several esteemed members of the fertility community, including Dr. Sangita Jindal, who currently serves as Director at Large on the ASRM Board of Directors and immediate past president of ASRM. Dr. Stephen Spandorfer from the Center for Reproductive Medicine at Weill Cornell Medical Center in New York and current president of SART. Sean Tipton is the Chief Advocacy and Policy Officer and formulates and executes media and government programs at ASRM. Salu Ribeiro is an embryologist at UCSF and the upcoming SRBT president, which is an affiliate society of ASRM. And then finally, Dr. Brett Davenport, who's not available at the moment, is medical director at the Fertility Institute of Northern Alabama in Huntsville. So we're excited if he's able to join the webinar to get his perspective on the implications of this ruling, as well as recent updates to the law. But we're going to start with you, Mr. Tipton. You've been in touch with the Alabama practices throughout this process. In a couple of minutes, can you please give us an overview of how last month's decision affected IVF in the state and provide any insight on relative and relevant policy changes following this ruling?
Sure, be happy to, and I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate all of you taking the time to be on today. It's a frightening time for infertility care in the United States, to say the least. And I think that was the overwhelming reaction from the practitioners and the professionals in the state of Alabama. You know, the court handed down its decision on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, which is traditionally the time when you announce things you hope everybody ignores. So I think they knew a little bit of what was coming. I think they didn't have any idea of the degree to which there was going to be this dramatic outpouring of outrage around the country. You know, and we knew the case was pending. I will tell you that our informal discussions with the attorneys after they argued the case to the Supreme Court, they felt pretty good. So they were a little surprised. And our other members in the state were very surprised. I don't think they knew it was coming at all. So we got a number of calls on Friday night, you know, and by Tuesday, the 3 biggest clinics in the state had all shut down. So Alabama Fertility Services in Birmingham and the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and the Center for Reproductive Medicine in Mobile, which was the defendant in the case. They all shut down pretty quickly because the decision left a whole range of questions unanswered, because the court, in its mysterious thinking, seemed to not be able to draw a distinction that anybody with any kind of common sense and maybe a microscope could draw the distinction between here's what an in vitro fertilized egg is and looks like, here's what a fetus developing in a uterus looks like, and here's what a born child looks like. And they are very different biological organisms that the court decided we're going to treat as exactly the same. And so there was a great deal of concern in the state. They shut down. You know, there were patients who were scheduled to come in to transfer. I had a phone call I will probably never forget with one of our member physicians in Alabama who say, I've got to call these people tonight and tell them they can't come in for their transfers this week. And how am I supposed to do that? And so it was devastating. It was devastating for the patients. It was devastating for the physicians. Do you want me to update the policy stuff now, or are you going to hold off on that?
You can get into it right now.
So just to be clear, so this now, so because of the enormous.
You froze.
It's his, not ours, right? Okay.
Suspense.
Sounds like he,
Okay, that's fine. So we'll just move on for right now, and then we can get into the policy discussion when he gets back on. So we expect prospective and current IVF patients to listen to this webinar. And as we know from some of the details of the case, this was brought on by a security failure in the cryo storage location adjacent to the IVF lab. Salu, let me turn to you. As a lab professional, can you please provide us an overview of the security measures labs normally undertake to prevent this kind of error?
Certainly. Thanks for the invitation, also having us here today. So most of the labs that I have interacted with, they do have secured locations where they keep their embryos, their oocytes, and their cryopreserved samples through either a key lock mechanism or security and cameras. So most of the locations, they do have that mechanism, which is make them secured unless if they have a violation of the key, or they were able to obtain the key and So, right, Sangita. Sangita is another member also from our laboratory group that aligns and have worked in various publications on uh, personnel requirement and also laboratories.
Yeah, thank you, Salu, and thank you very much for inviting me here. And I just want to say I'm immediate past president of SART. So I'm glad that Steve is president this year. I'm happy to be here to support him. So Salu is right. We have very stringent regulations. We can get into that later about staffing and physical plant and how the environment should be so tightly controlled. And one of the things, as Salu correctly points out, is very restricted access to the cryopreserved samples. They're in tanks that are in usually a space that is behind locked doors and only accessible actually to staff that are in the laboratory. There are some labs I know the physicians do not have access to the lab and they cannot get into the embryos, let alone anybody else, let alone a patient or any of the other clinical staff. So it's only authorized personnel only. I think that's very typical.
That's correct. Even the clinical staff or folks that are part of the clinic do not have access, including the physicians. We call it the intersanctum.
So this was a case where someone unauthorized was able to enter the facility, pulled out a vial. It seems like they burned themselves maybe on the liquid nitrogen and then dropped the vials on the ground. I mean, it sounds like an absolute freak accident. And, you know, I can already hear the patients listening to this when we talk about the word accident, and then we start to bring in other loaded terms like personhood. Sangita, while we have you here, can you chime in on the process a little bit from egg retrieval to transfer and the process of attrition here for their benefit, to put some of the science into perspective before we get into the policy?
Of course. So, as you know, or as hopefully our audience knows, we are in the business of creating embryos from eggs and sperm that we receive in the laboratory. And we have to start with quite a few eggs. We stimulate both ovaries in a controlled stimulation to retrieve oocytes or eggs from both ovaries, which we then use the sperm to create embryos. So the embryos are created. So for example, say I start with 10 eggs and 9 eggs are mature. I fertilize them with 9 sperm and I end up with 8 embryos. So the 8 embryos are growing in the incubator and they can grow for 4 to 5 days. And on day 5, we might have 4 out of those 8 that have developed. And then we'll biopsy those embryos and freeze those embryos, and we'll get back genetic testing, and maybe 2 are chromosomally normal. So you can imagine if we started with 10 eggs, we end up with 2 embryos. I think that's a pretty typical rate of attrition that we would see, and that would be a couple that would then be able to use both embryos to family build. I think that's pretty much how it works in the laboratory.
I think, you know, to add to that, there's other layers of complexity, because it's not just always people coming in for infertility treatment. I mean, you do have patients, for example, that may be getting, you know, along with this, that may be getting chemotherapy or something like that, that are a married couple and wanting to create embryos. So rulings like this certainly impact them. You also have, you know, along with that, couples that perhaps are doing, you know, we're doing a lot more genetic testing, not just for the chromosomes, as Sangita was mentioning, but also for like cystic fibrosis or for sickle cell, for you know, diseases that are obviously catastrophic for the newborn, you know, for the child. You can test for these with embryos. Well, now that you start making rules, creating these, you know, where do you do with these embryos? So the impact is not just we need a lot of eggs to end up with embryos to try to get a live birth and try to get somebody a baby. And certainly we are so much better than what we were 30 years ago when I did my fellowship. But I mean, the reality is we're not still at 100%, but we've so expanded what we do that it's not just infertility patients. There are other patients in other situations that are immensely involved. And then, you know, you don't know what to do with these. So there is some other significant impacts from all of this.
So let's pause here for a second and highlight some of the ongoing efforts made by ASRM, SART, SRBT, and Resolve to shed light on some of these implications for the IVF patients in the wake of this ruling. We saw some peaceful protests in Alabama where key members of these organizations were present in solidarity with patients and clinics and IVF professionals. Mr. Tipton, starting with you, can you please enlighten us on the progress of these efforts, what role ASRM plays in court before a ruling is made, and then we can open up to the rest of the panel on what we can and should expect from future petitions and protests.
So we did not.
Okay. We're having a
Internet.
Provide information to the
Sorry.
Why is it every time I talk, everybody seems to disappear? But we deferred to the Alabama Medical Society. They filed a very nice amicus. There is a weird sort of emergency last ditch, no, really, we mean it this time appeals process that's still in play. So a week ago, we did file an amicus in that one to point out all the factual errors, of which there were several in the decision, especially pertaining to what countries are doing in this space. So, for example, they
Looks like there might be a bandwidth issue. Maybe if you turn off your camera, Mr. Tipton, we can get the audio better.
Now you are mute. You are mute, Sean. Yes.
I promise I'm not touching anything. So we met with the Secretary of HHS along with 6 patients. Our CEO, Dr. Robbins, participated in that meeting in Birmingham. Went really well. Very dramatic testimony from patients who had had their service interrupted. We participated in a White House meeting later that week. One of our staff was an invited guest of Congressman Jamie Raskin at the State of the Union. You probably all saw the IVF patient who had an IVF 2-year-old and whose transfer was cut off because of the decision at the State of the Union. So there's been a lot going on. We think we're building some momentum. We need to hold some of these politicians who have professed their love for IVF accountable and to help them demonstrate that love in a tangible way in upcoming policy discussions. So, right now the clinics in Alabama are back at work. We did not support that legislation because it did not solve the underlying problem of conflating an in vitro fertilized egg and a baby. But we are pleased that they're able to get back to work and those patients are able to get that care again.
So we missed the update that you had to the legislation because the audio cut off. Can you remind us, please, what that is again?
Yeah, so the Alabama legislature passed really overwhelmingly. It is essentially an immunity bill. So it says that providers of IVF services, patients, and purveyors of goods and services used in the process have fairly strong immunity throughout the process. In fact, one of the votes in the legislature came from a member who's also an OBGYN who said, you can't provide blanket immunity for everything that ever happens. There has to be some for gross acts of negligence. So he was opposed to it for that reason. But at this point, it'll be interesting to see what the courts do with this law and how the courts reconcile what the Supreme Court said on the one hand. We'll go back and see what the trial court does with that information and in the context of this new law. But for right now, it's pretty much business for most of the clinics in Alabama.
Sure. Interesting perspective. I actually was reading a quote from Mike Pence, who, of all people, who you would think would be pretty opposed to this legislation or in favor of the legislation, in favor of the Supreme Court ruling. he came out and said he fully supports fertility treatments and thinks they deserve the protection of the law.
Like a lot of people, his perspective changed due to firsthand experiences.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, just from the nods on of your heads during Mr. Tipton's answer, it seems like the panel generally agrees that swift action was required to remedy parts of the decision that impacted IVF centers and allowed them to restart and continue practicing. One question that arose from the audience is whether this alteration to the law is a permanent fix or a short-term solution, because as we heard, it may prevent IVF patients from having any legal recourse if all of their embryos are damaged or destroyed by the clinic. And the example cited was the massive loss of embryos in California due to a cryostorage tank failure, which resulted in a $15 million settlement, and now may not be possible in Alabama if this new statute is broadly interpreted. So
as passed, there's no expiration date. That got amended out during the process. And there is a little bit of not complete immunity, but it's pretty squishy sounding to me. So I mean, it's gonna be up to a judge to decide that. And unfortunately, the only way we're gonna get a definitive answer is probably if there's another traumatic incident. So I don't think any of us want that to happen. So we may not get a definitive answer. We kind of hope, in fact, we may not get a definitive answer for a while because we would prefer if nothing bad happened.
Sean, I have a question for you from the audience. Did the current legislation has an expiration date or will protect the vendors as well?
As I just said, there's no expiration date in the bill as in the bills passed, and there are some protections for vendors that are included. So I think the term in the bill is purveyors of related goods and services or something like that. Our conversations with like culture media suppliers indicate they're willing to be back in business in Alabama. I have not confirmed with the shippers. You know, one of the first groups that shut down, in addition to the clinics, were the folks. You know, folks said, well, good, I'll ship my embryo to Atlanta and get it taken care of there. And the shippers very quickly said, we're not going to touch anything in or out of Alabama. I'm assuming that they have lifted that, but I have not heard that for sure.
I can respond to that. There are some vendors who are offering free storage outside of Alabama, so they will be willing to transport and ship to offsite to other, cryogenic storage facilities outside of Alabama. So I think shipping is happening, and it depends on the vendor.
Awesome. Thank you.
For the patients that are on the call or who will be listening to the webinar later, what are the risks associated with shipping embryos? Is there likely to be a loss there or a possibility for loss there? What states would be more likely to accept those? Salu or Sangita, I think would
Salu,
be
go
the best
ahead.
people to answer here.
I'll follow up.
Well, it's there's I think there's still unknowns because it's until something happened and we'll know what will happen. My concern is for my community, the embryologists, when they're handling the samples. Just thinking about, even though there's this protection, but in the fear of every time that you strip an oocyte and you inject an egg and now you're moving the embryos, you have that fear in your back of your mind that something could happen. And now it's a big change for us working. It's already a very protected environment, and the responsibility that we hold carrying those precious embryos and oocytes we are the first babysitters, as we call it, those embryos, and we take care of with them a lot, and we want to more information, and hopefully the courts can make some big decisions that we feel comfortable working with them when we're in Alabama. I think that's what the group that I spoke with, some embryologists, to communicate and come forward that work in Alabama to be part of this meeting, but unfortunately they couldn't. And I'm there for them.
Thank you, Salu. I agree with you completely. It's very much a chilling effect on the bench scientists who work in the embryology labs. This is what we do. We're very highly trained, highly skilled, lots of integrity, lots of regulation. We take it so seriously. And this is very tough for us to feel that we are empowered and confident in our jobs because of this hanging over our heads. As for shipping, I think just let me get back to that for a minute. Shipping happens all the time. But there's always risks. There's risks with everything. But with shipping, you have to rely on the shipper, someone with expertise, someone with experience. You don't want anything to go awry just out of anyone's control. There's always a chance. Loading it into a cryo transport tank, shipping it, receiving it, these are all points where there is risk. So I will not say it's without risk, but in the right hands, it can be done.
Okay, I've just received a message from Leah from Reprotech, and she said that they are shipping to and from Alabama. Okay.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Quickly getting back to the policy, Dr. Spandorfer, as president of SART and a clinician yourself, how can clinicians working through ASRM or with ASRM and other societies help legislatures draw the line between protecting IVF parents should negligent events occur and giving them, say, more rights to hold clinics and organizations accountable, while also not imposing too many risks for clinicians to practice?
I mean, yeah, I think as a field in general, we're a fairly regulated, closely watched field, and I think that's an important thing to really hammer home. We are, not that you can ever compare different fields, but basically we are definitely one of the ones that have a tremendous amount of oversight and involvement, starting from federal and FDA regulations to the CDC and its involvement with regulations in clinics and, basically certain descriptions of what makes a lab and accreditations of labs and things like that, to also, state and local laws. All of our labs at SART basically, are required to be either Pacheco or the Joint Commission basically accredited. And not only that, though, our organization SART itself, and it's not every IVF clinic in the country, but it's the majority. The majority of, over 85% of cycles in the country we represent. We ourselves as an organization put a lot of oversight. We have our own quality assurance clinic. We put our own guidelines out. We have a validation committee. We have a membership committee that looks very stringently at what we think requires, that are requirements for a member. So, I mean, I think basically in and of itself as a field, we're very careful in what we do within our own self-oversight, but as well as along with complying with governmental oversight from local, federal, and there's a whole bunch of different federal regulations that sort of control this. So I think there's a lot of that insight. That being said, I think basically most of the patients and a lot of the patients sort of come and go. Basically compared to my father-in-law who's an obstetrician, he delivers and has GYN patients and they just stay with him for years and years and years. And sometimes he's even delivered some of those he delivered. For us, our patients hope to come and go. They hope to see us. They hope to say goodbye. They want to have a baby and move on. So, there is a lot of reliance probably on us as physicians to be intimately involved with trying to create policies that make sense. And I think that is one of the comments that Sean brought up at the very beginning of all of this, is that you have to sort of sit back and look at something and say, does this actually make sense what they're suggesting? Does it really make sense that a couple of cells stuck together equals the same thing as a newborn, the newborn baby or a 3-year-old or an 8-year-old? I mean, most of us would say no. Obviously, it does get complicated when you start bringing religion in, which is certainly what happened there. But that being said, I think as the doctors, I think we have to really sort of take an extra step because, as I mentioned, our patients do come and go pretty quickly, but we're there. And so I think through ASRM and through, like, we basically have at ASRM, we have Sean, we have our, entire sort of set of people that are there just to help with the legislation and to fight these things. Alabama is by no way the first one that brought up, personhood laws. You mentioned that earlier at the onset of all this. Surprisingly, it's all over the country and in places people would not necessarily suspect or think. So I think it's a constant battle, and I think basically as doctors, not just in Alabama, we can't just sort of sit back and say, oh, I'm up in New York, it's a liberal place. This will never happen here. That's not the attitude we should be taking or could take, because the reality is you just never know. So I think that we need to be advocates for our field and for our patients in ways that they can't, because we know what happens.
And I will take the advantage that you are talking about other states, and I bring a question from the audience asking, what are the societies doing to prevent this from happening in other states?
Well, we've been rather active.
Education is important, right? Education of the population is very important.
Yeah, the patient voice is very important. So a couple of things to clarify. One is this Alabama Supreme Court decision was the first manifestation since Dobbs that really threatened IVF. So lots and lots of states have passed pregnancy termination restrictions or prohibitions. Some of those states have included language about life beginning at conception. However, that's all been in the context of a pregnancy termination. So it did not apply to the IVF embryo, did not apply to the IVF procedures. So up until this Alabama decision, in no state had anybody had to change their practice since Dobbs came down. Now, it is worth noting that Louisiana for a long time now has had a law in the books that prohibits the discard of embryos. So the clinicians, the practices there cannot discard embryos, but they are free to freeze them, to make decisions about them, to even relinquish them to the control of the patients. So I just think that's important to keep in mind. And the Alabama decision had no direct legal impact on any other state. So I just want to caution everybody, yes, be concerned, but don't panic. So we have been talking to legislators literally all over the country in the last couple of weeks, most of whom want to do some kind of protection, some kind of statutory clarification that there is in fact a legal distinction that mirrors the biological distinction between an in vitro fertilized egg and a baby. One of the things I have said somewhat glibly to journalists is anybody who thinks they're the same thing should go try to change the diaper of an in vitro fertilized egg and tell me how that goes, right? They clearly are not the same thing. So all we're asking is that the law mirror the empirical reality. And we're very busy, and we work very closely with Resolve and other organizations to try to do as much education as possible. I really think our job at this point is primarily to help policymakers understand the basic biology that Sangita alluded to earlier. Every fertilized egg is not a baby and is not going to be a baby. So to treat them that way creates a lot of problems.
That's exactly right, Sean. I wanted to say, for me, it's education. I feel that people will benefit from this, advocating the educated piece of what we do. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. It's combined with belief systems, and not to denigrate anybody's belief system. Of course, they should believe what they believe, but the actual science, I'm not sure is that clear to the average layperson. In fact, I'm sure it's not clear. So I would welcome any opportunity, actually, because of this that's happened in Alabama. If we are able to educate people in Alabama and around the country to a higher level of what we do, I think that's actually a great opportunity.
Just to conclude, Sangita's, the societies, what we're doing about it. SRBT, for example, our current president, Marina, has made a statement, but we're very grateful that we have ASRM group, Sean and the team, that the entire SM has a special group that will be working with the societies to speak with the legislators and the community and have resolve with the education. I think education is key. The more that we can educate our community and our local government, they will be able to help us to propagate the right message. Our county governments that has a lot of power. We always think it's the federal, but our local government has a lot of implications in communicating that.
Fantastic. There was a lot of interesting nuggets there. I mean, it's absolutely right. I mean, the people on the panel here, we're bi-coastal people, right? New York, Washington, D.C., California. You know, it's easy to get caught up in our bubbles. And when we read the Alabama legislation, it does make sense that it comes from a different perspective. And absolutely right that education is really important to try and help people understand the difference between an embryo and a growing fetus and an actual baby. I want to bring up, we mentioned some other states, and I wanted to bring up some additional legislation. So about 2 weeks ago, South Carolina lawmakers filed bills in the State House to protect IVF. In South Carolina House Bill H 5157, the proposed legislation.
I'm going to interrupt you because I got bad news on that front.
Okay, go ahead.
South Carolina was great. We were so excited. I mean, of all states, we had a bicameral, bipartisan, terrific bill. We were thrilled. We are now told they're going to gut it and put in the language from Alabama, which is crap. So we're pretty disappointed. If you want to go back and look at it, that was great. That we were excited. We were like, that's the model to point to. And now it looks like they're not going to pursue it that way. So it's very disappointing because you didn't expect that good a bill to come out of that particular state, which has been trying to pass full-on personhood for 15 years.
Yes, it's very interesting that another deep South state would propose the reverse legislation of what we saw from Alabama almost immediately after that decision. It's unfortunate that that bill was gutted because it did say that any fertilized human egg or human embryo that exists ex utero shall not be considered an unborn child, minor child, unborn person, unborn fetus, and that would protect reproductive technologists, stipulating specifically that fertility clinics are not required to preserve these eggs, embryos, and sperm outside of the human body. So, I mean, this seems like a positive, proactive step, despite the fact that it just got gutted. You know,
it's
what
not
other
done yet,
states?
right? We still have a little hope, but unfortunately, it's taken a turn for the worse. Maybe we can turn it back.
Are there other states that we think that this might be on the horizon? That's question number one. And question number two is, in an article written in the National Review recently, Ed Whalen from the Ethics and Public Policy Center
Never
wrote.
listened to Ed Whalen.
Yeah, he wrote that what was needed to reform the Alabama legislation was a one-sentence bill that states the word child in wrongful death statutes does not include IVF embryos. Is that enough?
It would be awful good, right? I mean, that's really gets at the heart of the matter. I think in terms of other states, so far, we've had a lot of discussions. We've seen language. We have not seen anything formally introduced yet in other states. And most of these are at least by intent positive. They want to provide some protection. Now, in some cases, even our friends don't know the science as well as they should, and they end up being sloppy. So that takes some work too, because it needs to be done correctly. But we've talked to people in Washington State. We've talked to people in California. We have talked to people in Iowa. We have talked to people in Ohio. We have talked to people in Kentucky. We've talked to people in Tennessee. Texas isn't in session, but we've talked to people in Texas too. Kentucky and Tennessee were looking pretty interesting because they had a similar kind of thing to just saying, let's make it clear that a in vitro fertilized egg is not a baby. And some of the anti-choice organizations have made it very clear, at least privately, if not publicly, that they would oppose that. And this is something they often do. They don't like to be seen publicly getting in the way of IVF, but they are happy to whisper to legislators, "Hey, don't pass that. It's bad." So we'll have to see how these things play out. But there's a lot going on. It's now the middle of March. A lot of these state legislators start slowing down over the next month, so they may not have enough time to do a lot. But there's a lot of discussion, and of course, there's federal legislation that got brought to the Senate floor since the Alabama case. The Tammy Duckworth, Susan Wild Access to Family Building Act, which is designed to preempt states from getting in the way of people getting the medical services they need for their fertility treatments. The Senate brought that up under a unanimous consent agreement, which means any single person could stop it. And Senator Hyde Smith from Mississippi drew the short straw and stopped that legislation. Just yesterday, Tammy Murray from Washington brought a bill to try to expand coverage for fertility services for the Veterans Administration, for our country's veterans. And Senator Langford from Oklahoma objected to that. So we're going to have to go the long way, I think, to get some of those moving again.
Sean, I was going to ask you about the veterans. I mean, to me, that seems like a very obvious demographic that they would want to support in family building. And why would they possibly object to that? What was the reason?
Well, there's a couple. One is it's going to cost money. Now, they did lift just this week. They lifted a requirement about patients being married.
Yep.
There's a bureaucratic challenge because in the active duty military system, which is called TRICARE, and in the VA, they're geared up to treat the individual person. And of course, in this case, you have to treat two people, and that seems to confuse them. So, we're trying to work with that, but a big objection is money. And a couple of years ago when we did this, we were making some progress and we got hung up on dispositional control of the embryos. That is, some opponents tried to argue, since the federal government was paying for the creation of these embryos, they could say what happened to them. And of course, we objected to that because we think those decisions need to remain in the hands of patients. So it got hung up on that. Now, we're going to pursue this very aggressively this year for military, for VA, and for civilian federal employees, because we're hoping this can be a way, especially for Republicans, to demonstrate their love of IVF and stay away from the abortion politics. So we're going there real hard. We think we're going to see a federal IVF insurance mandate bill introduced before the Easter recess, with the main sponsor being a Republican senator. That'll be the first time that has happened. So we are trying hard to take advantage of this moment. One of the famous political optimisms is never let a good crisis go to waste. And we are certainly trying to practice that. We've had a crisis, we've kind of come through it a little bit. Now we're going to try to take advantage of it.
I have a question from the audience, asking if you think that this decision can affect the number of embryos that an IVF clinic can create. Instead of freezing embryos, freeze eggs to avoid this issue. And also, if you could discuss for our patients that are attending here, the difference of freezing eggs and embryos, how much it can impact the chance of pregnancy.
So I think to answer the questions, first starting with the one of, would it change how you practice? I mean, traditionally practice has been sort of in that fashion that Sangita was talking about before, because basically I used to always describe the patients when I tried to explain to them that 10 eggs is not a guarantee, and that back in the day when Game of Thrones was popular, I'm like, they have Game of Thrones, we have games of attrition. And you start with your 10 eggs. They all don't fertilize, they all don't grow, and they all won't give you a baby. But certainly, I think if you're, as a practitioner, if I was in a state where basically, I knew my patients, let's say that it's a perfect world and nothing ever happens in the lab, but yet I'm in a state where basically the embryos, now the disposition of embryos for patients is either thaw them out and let them, take care of itself, donate them to either research or to be, used for control stuff in the lab, but not creating a baby out of it, or donate them to another couple. In probably 30 years of practice, I really think I've seen one couple ever do that. So basically, in a way of trying not to have couples be stuck with extra embryos, which is what this would create, it's going to require you to only fertilize a few, and that is going to really significantly impact patients, patients' prospects of getting pregnant. There's no doubt, of what that would do. So certainly that would change how I would practice, and probably many people would practice because of the fear, of that. The other part of your question, though, is the difference in freezing eggs versus embryos. And look, we've been freezing eggs for a long time for people mostly, God forbid, that had, some sort of cancer. We're going to get chemotherapy, radiation, or didn't have to be cancer, but some other illness that may impact their future fertility reserve. But the way we used to freeze eggs was not very good. And the lab people can certainly attest to that, but that was all we had to offer. That changed pretty dramatically with vitrification and changing of how we freeze eggs to where, freezing eggs definitely is an option to offer patients. But I think while we're much better at freezing eggs and we have decent success rates at freezing eggs and far better than there was before, still probably at this point in time, we are better at freezing embryos rather than eggs. And particularly, like if you're doing something like testing, like Sangita mentioned, and when you look at overall trends of IVF cycles in this country, there's a huge swing to everybody doing a lot of what's called PGT-A, which is testing embryos for chromosome abnormalities. There's a huge swing for that. And, basically, we know there's a lot of attrition that goes along with that. I mean, if you look at like a 35-year-old where 50% of their embryos may be normal, but you go to a 40-year-old where 10 or 15% of their embryos may be normal. So, I mean, you can just imagine what those numbers do. But if you then are creating eggs, but limiting the number of embryos you're creating, you're going to be freezing an egg, then you're going to thaw the egg and then fertilize it later, and then have to freeze an embryo. So you're introducing extra processes that definitely cannot help enhance the situation, enhance the success rate. So